Number 10. Walter O Grady. Walter O Grady spent 28 years behind bars before finally being released from prison in 2020, when a Pennsylvania judge vacated his conviction in the murder of a young 4-year-old girl. This is obviously a horrifying thing to happen. Just imagine spending 28 years behind bars as a child murderer when you didn't actually murder the child. By the time he got out, Walter was 55 years old. He managed to escape his conviction with the help of the exact same Philadelphia District Attorney's Office that prosecuted him back in 1988. So how did this happen? Well, in 1988, jurors at his trial decided to convict him for the murder of Barbara Jean Horn, who'd been found dead inside of a cardboard TV box near Walter's home in North Philadelphia. It didn't help that Walter had given a confession for the crime. However, prosecutors now believe that he was coerced into a false confession. It was thanks to DNA evidence found at the crime scene being reviewed earlier in 2020 that Walter finally got released. As for the identity of the true murderer, that's still a mystery. We may never know who actually killed this innocent little girl. Number 9. Richard Phillips. Meet the man who spent more years behind bars than any other wrongfully imprisoned human in America. His name is Richard Phillips, and he spent 45 years in jail for a crime that he never committed. When a judge finally declared him a free man, the first thing Richard did was go for groceries. According to CNN, Richard was amazed to discover just how many different types of orange juice are now being sold in grocery stores. But this is just one revelation that Richard is going to have to deal with after spending 45 years of his life isolated in prison. Even though his murder conviction was thrown out by a judge in 2018, Philip was already 72 years old. He spent the majority of his life imprisoned for never committing a crime. This itself is a crime against humanity. But what exactly was Richard Phillips charged with? As an auto worker in Detroit back in the 1970s, Philip was charged with the murder of a man named Gregory Harris, who had been dragged out of his car and then shot to death in June of 1971. It was the testimony of the victim's brother-in-law that led to Phillips' arrest. Apparently, Richard Phillips had met with another man named Richard Palumbo at a bar to discuss how they had murdered Gregory Harris. Both men were convicted and Phillips was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. It wasn't until 2010 when Richard Palumbo, the other man arrested, finally told the parole board that he killed Gregory Harris along with Gregory's brother-in-law, and that they had pinned it on Richard Phillips even though he had nothing to do with it. It then took 4 more years for the evidence to be revealed, and even more years after that for Richard to finally be released. What do you think should be done to reimburse these people for their wrongful imprisonment? What kind of reparations are appropriate? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. And then don't forget to subscribe to World List if you haven't already, for more exciting videos just like this one. Number 8. Robert Du Bois. Robert Du Bois also spent a shocking amount of time behind bars for a murder he didn't commit. The Tampa local went to prison for murder when he was just 18 years old. He then spent 37 years behind bars before eventually being exonerated. When he was released, he was 55 years old. He spent his entire adult life incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit. Judge Christopher Nash finally vacated Robert's life sentence and removed his name from the sex offender registry. Apparently, this all occurred when it was learned that his conviction could no longer be supported by the evidence available. But according to Fox News, there hadn't really been much evidence against Robert in the first place. The prosecutors had based their entire case on a testimony from an unreliable source and a bite mark. And it was the bite mark that ultimately sent Robert to prison in 1983 for the murder of Barbara Grams. And it was also the bite mark almost 40 years later that finally set him free. It turned out that the bite mark should not have been enough to convict Robert for murder. The bite mark was too unreliable. It's now considered junk science. And even after spending almost 40 years behind bars, Robert maintained his innocence. All of this helped him finally be released, and hopefully he can spend the remaining years of his life with some semblance of peace. Number 7. John Thompson. Next among the wrongfully imprisoned is John Thompson, a native of New Orleans who was wrongly arrested for an armed robbery and a completely unrelated murder way back in 1984. But here's where things get gruesome. According to the New Orleans Historical, the prosecutors had intentionally secreted any evidence that suggested John Thompson was innocent during the trial. This included blood evidence that directly proved John was not the man responsible for the armed robbery. Because of the exclusion of the evidence, John Thompson was convicted and sentenced to death in 1985. Thankfully, just a month before John Thompson was due to be executed back in 1999, a defense investigator discovered the blood evidence and the evidence of the cover-up. The conviction was thrown out immediately, and John was taken off death row. But even though his life was saved, he was still in prison. It took another 3 years for prosecutors to throw out his murder conviction. He had a retrial in 2003, and a New Orleans jury took less than an hour to acquit him of the murder for which he had nearly been killed. John Thompson walked out of the courtroom a free man, and probably more than a little angry with the justice system. Number 6. Ricky Davis. Ricky Davis is yet another innocent man who spent way too long in prison for a murder he didn't commit. After spending 15 years locked up behind bars like some sort of animal, Ricky Davis was finally released. But just what exactly happened to this California man to get him stuck in such a miserable situation? It's all about the interrogation techniques. According to ABC News, Ricky Davis was initially convicted in 2005 for the murder of Jane Halton because of insanely aggressive interrogations that led to a forced confession from his girlfriend at the time. Transcripts from 1999 showed that a detective urged Ricky Davis's girlfriend to confess until she finally did. Murder charges were then filed against Davis and his girlfriend of the time. She testified against him, and Davis was sentenced to 16 years to life in state prison. However, he maintained his innocence throughout the sentence. He was only released because of new evidence that came to light. DNA samples proved that Ricky Davis is innocent, and since his release, a new man has been placed in custody for the original murder. Number 5. Ricky Jackson. The award for man who spent the second longest amount of time in prison for a crime that he didn't commit goes to Ricky Jackson, who spent 39 years in jail for killing a man named Harold Franks outside of a convenience store. According to the police, a pair of assailants had thrown acid into Harold's face, beat him, shot him a few times, then stole around $425 from him. Ricky Jackson was elsewhere at the time of the crime, but that didn't stop detectives from collecting statements from witnesses who claimed Jackson was present at the crime and that he even fired the gun that killed the man. And even though the shaky witness failed to identify Ricky Jackson in a police lineup, Ricky was convicted of murder anyway. In 1975, Jackson and a few of his friends were sentenced to die by the electric chair. In 1977, Ricky Jackson had his sentence reduced to life in prison on a technicality. The year after that, capital punishment in Ohio was obliterated. He spent the majority of his life sitting in prison, and it wasn't until 2011 when a Cleveland magazine published an article about Jackson's conviction and how totally ridiculous and implausible the testimony that condemned him was that some headway began being made for his release. Some very special people took interest in the article. The original witness behind the conviction came forward and rescinded his testimony from 1975, and 3 years later, in 2014, prosecutors dismissed charges against all 3 of the original convicts, including Ricky Jackson. Number 4. 3 men cleared. This unbelievable story is about 3 men from Maryland who spent 36 years together in prison for a crime they didn't commit in 1984. Alfred Chestnut, Ransom Watkins, and Andrew Stewart were only teenagers when they were wrongfully sentenced to serve life in prison for murdering another Baltimore teenager. In 2019, they were finally released from prison after a judge cleared their convictions, and all charges involved were dropped. Circuit Court Judge Charles Peters apologized to the grown men, but said he also would understand if his words didn't mean much after the trio's horrible ordeal. According to NBC News, the 3 men were arrested in November of 1983 when a 14-year-old boy named DeWitt Duckett was shot in the neck while walking to class at his Baltimore school. At the time, the 3 boys became immediate suspects, and it honestly didn't take much to convict them. This is made even more disturbing by the fact that police reports from the time of the murder showed witnesses telling police that a suspect had killed the boy, fled the scene, dumped the gun, and got away. But the authorities chose to ignore the witnesses and instead blamed the trio for the murder. However, the real murderer will never be convicted since he was shot to death in 2002. Number 3. Walter Forbes. Imagine being released from prison after almost 40 years and then being sent directly to a COVID-19 quarantine. It seems like a nightmare come to life, and yet that's exactly what happened to Walter Forbes from Michigan when at the age of 63, he was finally freed from prison after being proved innocent for the crime that had originally landed him behind bars. Walter had spent most of his life incarcerated and had long dreamed of being free. Then in 2020, when Walter was finally exonerated, the earth was in the middle of a pandemic. He was freed from jail, then sent directly to quarantine, where he was forced to spend his first days as a free man not quite so free. It's a little ironic, but at least Walter is no longer behind bars. As for the original incarceration, Walter was convicted in 1983 when a witness told a jury that him and 2 other men torched an apartment house in Jackson, Michigan, killing the occupant inside. For his crime, Walter was imprisoned for 38 years. The conviction wasn't tossed out until new evidence was brought forward that supported grounds for a new trial. There was a 2-day hearing, new evidence was introduced, and Walter was found innocent. Number 2. Joseph Webster. A Tennessee man named Joseph Webster walked free in 2020 after serving nearly 15 years behind bars. In 2006, Webster was tried for first-degree murder in the 1998 slaying of Leroy Owens, after Owens was chased down and beaten to death with a cinder block. 8 years after Owens was killed, Webster was forced into the courtroom, where he was found guilty by a jury of his supposed peers, mostly because of a false witness testimony that directly identified him as the murderer. Joseph Webster was then sentenced to life in prison. So how did he get free? It was all thanks to a special unit formed in 2016 to review wrongful convictions. Joseph Webster was the first to apply for a review of his case, as he maintained his innocence throughout his imprisonment. It soon became clear that the witness testimony was nonsense, and also that there was a serious lack of evidence. Luckily, the unit was able to exonerate Joseph Webster, and he has since been reunited with his mother and his sons. Number 1. Louis Vargas. Louis Vargas served 16 years in prison after he was convicted for unspeakable violence against 3 women, all of whom had been victims of the so-called teardrop rapist. But even after getting charged with such inhumane crimes, Louis continued to claim he was innocent. He even reached out to the California Innocence Project to try and overturn the verdict, saying that after he was arrested, more crimes were perpetrated that were identical to the ones he was convicted of. In essence, it was like if a very unique serial killer was supposedly arrested, but those same unique killings continued to happen. It was obvious Louis didn't do it. In the end, it was a good thing Louis was able to get a great attorney. His attorneys requested a new series of DNA testing, and this resulted in Louis being released from prison and cleared of the crimes. And if you've never heard of the teardrop rapist, it's time you became aware of this particular dangerous man and learned to recognize his unique appearance. Since 1996, this villain has been linked to more than 30 violent and despicable sexual assaults all across Los Angeles. The reason for the name is that the suspect apparently has a teardrop tattoo that is extremely distinct. But perhaps even more disturbing than Louis being imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit is the fact that the terrifying culprit is still believed to be at large, on the loose, and very dangerous. Volcanoes can be extremely dangerous and scary places, and there are thousands of these steep mountains of boiling lava all over the world, many of them open to the public for tourism. And unfortunately, many of the visitors to these volcanoes don't take their power seriously. Just look at the family of 3 who fell into a volcano near Naples, Italy, and died. It all happened when a young boy, only 11 years old, crossed a safety barrier and fell into a hole at the Solfatara crater. The boy's mother and father, both in their 40s, tried to save the child, and they also died in the process. It's only natural that the parents would attempt to save their child, but unfortunately, they left behind their other son, a 7-year-old boy. According to the report from The Independent, it was unclear at the time if the family was immediately overcome by gases or boiled within a river of molten lava. Emergency crews did rush to the scene, but unfortunately, they were not able to help. Once in a pool of lava, there really isn't much that can save you. As for the volcanic crater that the family fell into, it's a hugely popular destination for both local Italians and tourists from all around the world. The crater is inside the Flagria Fields, which itself is a massive network of ancient volcanic craters. It's boiling hot just inches below the hardened surfaces of the field. Even though the Solfatara crater hasn't erupted since 1198, it is still super dangerous. Number 9. First person to fall into Mount St. Helens. Is it possible to fall into a volcano and survive? In April of 2008, a man named John Slemp became the first person ever to fall into the crater at Mount St. Helens. As an experienced snowmobiler, John Slemp was out having the time of his life. He took his snowmobile up to the rim of the crater with his son and a family friend, and then they all climbed on their bellies to peek over the dangerous overhanging shelf of snow at the very top of the mountain, to get a clearer view directly into the crater. Unfortunately, the ground gave way and John fell directly into the volcano. He fell about 150 feet before landing on a snowbank, which was an absolute miracle. But according to ABC News, When John stood up and dusted himself off and moved to climb back up the crater, the snowbank crumbled beneath him and he tumbled another 1,300 feet into the crater, creating an avalanche of debris and snow. Luckily for him, there wasn't anything dangerous inside the crater. It wasn't like there was an opening at the bottom leading to a giant cavern of lava. The sheriff's office was called, a rescue team coordinated how to get the man out, and a helicopter soon came to the rescue. John was very lucky that he'd been wearing a helmet and a heavy suit, and that he hadn't banged anything important off any hard rocks during the fall. After 2.5 hours of being stuck, John was airlifted from the crater, perfectly healthy, if not a little shaken. Hey, real quick, if you're new to the channel, welcome! Give this video a like and hit that subscribe button for more videos like this one. Number 8. GoPro Volcano Dive. It's one thing to accidentally fall into a volcano, and it's something altogether different when you volunteer to dive into one. Yet that's exactly what George Karunis did back in 2019 at the Merom Crater, located inside an active volcano in the South Pacific. George is a documentary filmmaker, and he decided it would be a good idea to dive into the crater with a GoPro and a selfie stick. George described standing at the cusp of the volcano as looking through a window to hell. Using the GoPro and a few other camera systems, George descended 1,200 feet into the volcano. There was acid rain so powerful and so acidic that it could have been leaking from a dead battery. There was horrible weather, intense heat from the bubbling lava, and just getting into the crater involved an intense vertical descent down a loose face of jagged rock. But despite this, George got down so incredibly close to the pit of lava that it splashed onto his silver heat-proof suit and burned a hole in his clothing as well as one of his cameras. And even though it was such a horrifying experience and George could have been swallowed by the lava at any second, he claims that the adrenaline kept him completely calm, even as he stared directly into the glowing pit of fire. This is probably the closest that anyone on Earth has come to staring into the sun at a close range. But what do you think? Is this the kind of adventure you would try for yourself? Number 7. Vacation Gone Wrong. The island of Bali in Indonesia is one of the most popular resort islands in the world. It's insanely popular with Europeans and Australians as a place to hang out, drink some beers, and enjoy the beautiful weather. It's also one of the most volatile places on Earth, as Indonesia is located within the Ring of Fire. Basically, Indonesia is filled with volcanoes constantly threatening to erupt, but even volcanoes that are not erupting can be extremely dangerous. When a Swedish tourist decided to visit an active volcano during his trip to Bali, he signed his own death warrant. And this is how it happened. The young man and 2 of his friends woke up in the earliest hours of the day and decided to take a hike along the rim of Mount Batur. This is an active volcano, and the rim of the crater is located 5,633 feet above sea level. While strolling around the rim, the Swedish tourist lost his footing and fell inside. He plummeted 500 feet directly into the volcano's mouth and died immediately upon impact. Rescuers were able to evacuate the body. Imagine how mortified his 2 friends must have been when they witnessed their friend fall into a volcano. Talk about some PTSD. As for Mount Batur, it has erupted at least 26 times since 1840, according to NBC News. Its latest eruption was in 2000, but it regularly lets off large hisses of steam. Number 6. Death in the Congo. Moving across the whole world to the Democratic Republic of Congo, we see yet another tourist who tragically died falling into another boiling volcano. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a much more obscure tourist destination than the island resort of Bali. And here's how this death happened. Cecilia Suyan climbed over the rim of a fiery crater to take a selfie. Yeah, that's right, this death can be attributed to the selfie madness that has come over our world. Cecilia had been climbing the Nyiragongo volcano at the border of Rwanda and the Congo when she made her deadly mistake. She stepped out of the safety zone, tried to take a photo, but accidentally slipped and fell into the mouth of the beast. She ended up falling about 300 feet before coming to a stop at the edge of a massive lake of lava. Unfortunately, Cecilia ended up staying stuck at the bottom of the volcano. Rescue efforts were called off almost immediately, even though the woman initially showed signs of still being alive. Witnesses could see her moving inside the volcano, but she was unable to get rescued due to poor visibility and danger to the rescue team. She ended up dying at the bottom of the volcano, despite a team of 20 peacekeepers and professional volcanologists working to retrieve her body. Number 5. Body-shaming fall of death. We're gonna simmer down for our next story. Rather than falling into a volcano, Carissa Miller fell into a frozen lake while ice fishing with her best friend at Beacon Cove Marina in Michigan. She apparently slipped, banged her knee on the dock, and then plummeted into the icy waters. This is definitely a better situation than falling into a volcano, but it can still prove to be deadly. But here's where the story gets a little controversial. The sheriff's office, for whatever reason, decided to film Carissa being rescued and then post the video on their Facebook account. Apparently, the sheriff's office wanted to warn people about the dangers of ice fishing, but instead, people body-shamed Carissa and called her a whole bunch of nasty names. In the video of the rescue, Carissa is seen being pulled out of the frigid water in tights and a sports bra, and this led people to being mean on the internet and calling her names. And while this is a real shame on some of the internet society or trolls, at least Carissa survived the horrifying incident and wasn't cooked alive in a volcano. Number 4. New Zealand volcano disaster. So now moving back to volcanoes, slipping into a volcano is definitely a tragic event, but most of these incidents happen the same way. Somebody trips, somebody's not paying attention, somebody thinks they can cross the safety line and live to tell the tale. And then somebody falls into a giant hole filled with sizzling lava. But what you don't expect is to be killed by a volcano when you're nowhere near the top of it. Yet that's exactly what happened at the White Island incident in New Zealand, when at least 22 people died and 47 were injured after the Wakari volcano unexpectedly erupted. This horrifying incident went down in 2019, when the most active volcano in all of New Zealand randomly exploded and destroyed the lives of all the tourists who'd been visiting the island at the time. The tragedy happened early in the afternoon on December 9th, when a massive gush of ash, toxic gas, and huge boulders were blown somewhere around 12,000 feet into the sky. Despite dramatic efforts from rescue crews to save lives, it took 2 weeks just to find all the victims of the random eruption. What's really crazy is that nobody saw it coming. I mean, as the most active volcano in the country, there is some expectation that it will erupt at some point, but this incident is proof that humans really have no idea how to predict the exact moment when any volcano will erupt, causing massive death and destruction. Number 3. Flying over a volcano. Imagine flying over a volcano while wearing a wingsuit. If you can't, that's probably because it's absolutely preposterous. What if something went wrong, or your wingsuit didn't do what it was supposed to do and you literally fell out of the clouds and directly into a bubbling pit of fire in the heart of a volcano? That's a risk most people aren't willing to take, including me. And yet a wingsuit enthusiast named Roberta Mancino jumped from a helicopter at 15,000 feet in the air and then glided through a plume of ash and smoke to get an awesome aerial view of the Villarrica volcano in Chile. This extreme adventure had been a childhood dream of Roberta's, and one that she was finally able to complete in 2016. She literally jumped out of a helicopter and then glided over the lip of the volcano, staring straight into its lava lake. How cool is that? Nothing ended up going wrong with Roberta's flight over the volcano, and she touched down with a smile on her face. What a happy end to this story. Number 2. Dead in the Kilauea crater. Hawaii itself is a volcano. All the Hawaiian islands are made from the leftovers of volcanic eruptions. Because of this, it should be absolutely no surprise that sometimes people tumble into the very volcanoes that they live on. One of the most recent deaths came from the Kilauea crater, when a 38-year-old man's corpse was discovered sitting at the bottom early on a Sunday morning. The Hawaii Tribune-Herald reported that the man who fell into the crater did so alone, and considering his body wasn't found until early in the morning, he'd likely been visiting the volcano at night when he fell in. That raises a whole bunch of strange questions. I mean, who goes to a volcano at night? In any case, it was unclear at the time of discovery why he fell into the volcano, but it's safe to say he died immediately upon impact. I guess this is just one of those unfortunate things that'll happen from time to time when you go for a nightly stroll up the side of a volcano. Number 1. Volcano Survivor. So not everyone who falls into a volcano dies. In 2007, a man fell into an active lava flow and he pulled himself back out of it. But how is that possible? Well, he fell into Oldoño Lengai, which is one of the most bizarre volcanoes in the world. You see, Tanzania has exceptionally cold lava. The lava is so cold that it doesn't even turn red. Instead, the lava is consistently black. It only reaches a temperature of around 950 degrees Fahrenheit, making it half as hot as most other volcanoes. It's so cool that while a man was giving a tour on the volcano to a group of foreigners, he fell into the lava and then climbed out as if he had simply fallen into a big puddle of goo. Of course, he still had severe burns on one arm and both legs and needed to spend a lot of time in the hospital, but at least he didn't die. If it had been any other volcano, he would have been engulfed like Gollum when he fell into the fires of Mount Doom. Depending on where you live in the world, you are susceptible to animal invasions. In fact, nobody's home is really safe. Take, for example, the bear cub that tried to enter Douglas Harder's home through the cat door. According to the report from CNN, the bear attempted to invade Harder's Idaho home by poking his head in through the tiny cat door. Harder managed to get the most adorable photograph of the bear with its head stuck inside the tiny hole in the door, and nothing more came of the incident. However, it's not the first time he had been invaded by bears. Before this adorable incident, a bear entered the sliding door of his second-floor deck and completely pillaged his condo. It apparently took Harder over 2 hours to clean the mess made by the rampaging bear. According to Harder himself, the bears could care less that he's even there. Sometimes he spots them hanging out on his deck. He sees them skulking around his house, and even when he goes outside and tries to scare them away, they're completely unfazed. In the most recent bear invasion, he had his pantry raided. A bear appeared to have once again gone through a sliding glass door, but this time it got into some brownie mix, a can of soda, and a chocolate bar. It then left a giant poop in the middle of Harder's living room. Obviously, with wild bears, the situation could always be much worse than this. Harder is lucky the bears have never tried to hurt him. They're just really big fans of his property. Number 9. Cougar in the kitchen. A curious bear in the living room is one thing, but how about a hungry cougar in the kitchen? In the Bolivian capital of La Paz, a city that rests high in the mountains of South America, a resident apparently came home to find a wild cat just kind of hanging out in her kitchen. As reported by DW News, park rangers were called in to capture the enormous savage cat. The rangers found the cougar stretched out, dangerously dehydrated, and kind of starving. They ended up feeding the poor animal for 2 months before releasing it back into the wild. As for the resident who found the cougar in her kitchen, she just kind of went on with her life as usual. It's not clear how the animal broke in or why it didn't leave. Perhaps it was hoping someone would grill it up some dinner. But the video footage uploaded online proves that it got stranded in the woman's kitchen with nowhere to go. Too bad it wasn't a bit smaller, then maybe she could have had a new guard dog. Number 8. Snake invasion. Probably the last thing anyone wants to be attacked by is a giant snake while sitting on the toilet. But that's pretty much what happened to a Thai man at work when he took a bathroom break. He found an enormous python dangling from the bathroom ceiling. This happened in the north of Thailand, where these kinds of snakes slithering about is more common than in other places in the world. The poor shop assistant had simply just wanted to relieve himself when the giant 8-foot serpent came out of nowhere, apparently breaking through the ceiling in a hunt for food. The brave guy managed to capture video of the snake, which quite frankly boggles the mind. If I were trying to use the toilet and a massive monster broke through the ceiling, it's probably the last thing I would do is go for my phone and start taking photos. What about you? However, the serpent appeared to be just as dismayed by what had happened. It turned around and tried to slink back through the ceiling, and nobody has seen the slippery snake since. According to the New York Post, the reticulated python is the longest python ever and can grow to be over 20 feet in length. These are animals that should be feared, especially in Southeast Asia. In 2018, a giant python killed a woman in Indonesia and then swallowed her whole. If you saw a giant snake in your bathroom, would you try and take pictures of it, or would you run for the hills? Let me know how bold you think you are in the comments below. And if you haven't already, click that subscribe button for more videos like this one. Number 7. A sleeping seal. New Zealand is home to a lot of incredible things. It's where the infamous hobbits live. Mordor is located somewhere in the north, and adorable penguins call the island country home. I mean, honestly, New Zealand seems like one of the raddest places on Earth. A local resident was reminded of the magic of New Zealand when she came home to discover a baby seal just hanging out in her kitchen. The darling baby seal apparently wandered away from the water through a suburb, across a few roads, past a cat door, then up the stairs before it stopped in the woman's kitchen. It's a journey that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially when seals usually stay fairly close to the water. But nonetheless, that's where the animal ended up. It politely invaded the woman's house and then decided to take a nap on her couch. She caught some pretty amazing photographs of the seal hanging out in the corner of the couch, just like a cute kind of fluffy dog. The woman who found the seal called the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, also known as the SPCA, who then called the Department of Conservation. Apparently, the Conservation Department had been looking for the seal pup all afternoon. It had just been weaned from its mother, and for whatever reason, it had run away and gotten lost in the city. Bye, Mom. Hello, big new world. Number 6. Giant lizard invasion. So we've had bears coming in through the cat door, snakes in the workplace bathroom. Now let's talk about a whole species expanding their territory across the US. There's a group of giant, over 4 feet long South American lizards invading the Sunshine State of Florida. Why? Well, people grew fond of the jumbo lizards and brought them to the United States to keep them as pets. But because they grow to be so large and vicious, most pet owners simply open their doors or gates and let them outside so they can go and do their own thing. They're known as tegu lizards, and there are currently 2 massive colonies of them living in Florida. According to a report from Reuters, these massive reptiles are planning an invasion of the Carolinas and central Texas. These are predatory lizards that are extremely good at adapting to their surroundings, which has made them able to thrive in the United States even though they belong in South America. What makes this invasion so dangerous? Well, tegu lizards have strong jaws. They can thump animals with their massive tails, and they kind of love stuffing themselves on the eggs of indigenous American animals. These lizards are an invasive species. If they continue to invade more states and branch out, they could have a detrimental effect on the native species of the southern United States. But we won't truly know how intense the infiltration will be until the effects are already upon us. Number 5. The White House raccoons. One of the strangest animal invasions actually involves the White House. According to the Washingtonian, there has been an aggressive raccoon or several aggressive raccoons that have invaded the White House and even attacked reporters. A CNN Washington correspondent was captured on film screaming at a raccoon to get away from him on a live broadcast. The video, of course, went viral on YouTube, but this wasn't the first time that a raccoon had invaded the White House. They apparently have a long history of showing up uninvited and have attacked multiple news crews on the North Lawn throughout the years. Someone even tried to capture the raccoons using a marshmallow inside of a steel trap, but the next day, the cage was empty and the marshmallow had mysteriously vanished. It's unclear where these raccoons live, but it seems that no matter what anyone does, they continue to invade the White House and attack reporters. Number 4. Wild cows invade grocery store. Hong Kong can be a pretty strange place. It's one of the only places on Earth where a herd of cows has been caught invading a grocery store. They trashed the place and started to eat all its fruits and vegetables. This incident happened when 4 cows entered the Fusion supermarket and ravaged the place for at least 2 hours. There's even video footage of the cows wreaking havoc that can be found online. Of course, this went down in a rural town, but it's still a pretty shocking thing to see. But what's really hilarious is that even after the cows made their getaway, 3 of them were spotted later that night at around 10:30, as if waiting for the store to reopen. According to a district counselor for the region, there were worries that the cows might strike again. There are about 1,100 wild cows wandering and grazing around Hong Kong. Lots of people think it's annoying to have these cows roaming onto roads with traffic, but they don't understand that these sites were where the cows and their predecessors used to eat and live before the landscapes were covered with cement and turned into a city, said the chairman of the Lantau Buffalo Association, Ho Loi. So maybe us humans are the ones that invaded these animals' homes instead of the other way around. Number 3. Planet of the Monkeys. A real-life Planet of the Apes situation is unfolding in the ancient Thai town of Lop Buri. Ever since the coronavirus struck, this city has been devoid of tourists, and this has caused the local monkeys to go to war with each other. Lop Buri is 800 years old, but it's been a very popular tourist destination since the 90s. But since traveling has been limited and not as many people are in the area, there hasn't been a lot of free food for the local troublemaking monkeys. Then on March 12th, a war broke out between 2 different factions of the monkeys in the center of the town, resulting in an epic street brawl that terrified the locals. Apparently, the turf war involving dozens of monkeys started over a single item of food. Make no mistake, these monkeys are invaders. Since they're basically starving, they have no choice but to invade the local townspeople and steal their food. The city residents started to lay out food offerings at the local temple to calm down the crowds of angry monkeys. Without more tourists coming soon, it's unclear how long such large troops of monkeys will survive. Number 2. Adorable fawn invasion. This next story is a lot more adorable than rampaging monkeys or giant lizards. A fawn recently broke into a Colorado home by breaking through the basement window. This is something that would normally be done by a burglar, but the fawn didn't want to steal anything. The young deer likely got lost and accidentally smashed itself through the window. Officers were called in and forced to use a blanket to grab the rioting animal and carry it out to the front yard. Luckily, the fawn was uninjured, and after it was released, it hopped away in search of its mother and vanished into the bushes. Still, it's quite a surprise for the homeowners who probably didn't expect to be invaded by Bambi. Number 1. Roach City. Nobody likes roaches. In fact, depending on where you live, cockroaches might be the bane of your existence. Even in New York City, cockroaches can be a major problem. But what a lot of people don't know is that back in 1979, there was a monstrous cockroach infestation that would make headlines across the country. It all happened when police in New York responded to someone's complaint about a barking dog. When they arrived at the house, what they found instead of a barking dog were literal rivers of cockroaches streaming out of the windows of a modest two-family home. It proved to be one of the worst invasions of cockroaches in the state's history. So how many cockroaches are we talking about here? There were an estimated 1 million German cockroaches inside of a single home. According to the New York Times article, it may have been the largest household infestation of cockroaches ever recorded. It's not clear what happened to these roach invaders, but the house was probably abandoned and condemned. This was during one of the worst roach epidemics in history, when people were just kind of forced to live with the problem. Even though the roaches were spreading salmonella poisoning and were responsible for an asthma epidemic inside big cities. Today, the roach issue is mostly confined to the sewers and to dark basements, but some German cockroaches still plague New York homes, even in 2021. One of the dumbest ways that anybody has died in these modern times is by selfie. So not the act of taking the selfie, but the act of taking a selfie in an extraordinarily risky situation. The first embarrassing and dumb death on the list today goes to a guy in India who was killed after trying to take a selfie with a cobra. We can understand how this might seem like a good idea. I mean, what could go wrong? After all, not many people probably have a selfie with an actual king cobra hanging around their neck, but it didn't go the way the guy planned. The snake charmer gently placed the snake around the guy's neck. The man then posed for a selfie, but the snake was not at all interested in having its picture taken. Instead of smiling politely, the snake bit the man right on his head. But the man didn't even realize right away that he'd been bitten. It wasn't until a few minutes had passed that he realized something was very wrong. But unfortunately for him, he never would make it to the hospital alive. It would be the last selfie this man ever took. The venom raced through his veins, and within just minutes, he lost consciousness, and soon after he died. Number 9. Parking brake fail. Driving a car can be risky business. For millions of people, it's something that must be done every day to get to work and make money. But for some, a simple drive can turn into a deadly nightmare. Nobody knows this better than the woman who ended up being run over by her own truck in a parking lot in Colorado Springs. You're probably wondering just how somebody manages to run themselves over. Well, for whatever reason, the woman got out of her car, went to the trunk, then her car rolled backwards and pinned her underneath it. She had allegedly stuck the gear in reverse, but had for some insane reason thought the parking brake was on and would prevent her car from rolling backwards. And that clearly was not the case. Even if the parking brake was on, it failed miserably, and the woman was crushed to death by her own vehicle. Number 8. Lava lamp explosion. It's simply not feasible that everyone is going to make intelligent decisions. Take, for example, the man from Washington who died from an exploding lava lamp. According to NBC News, Philip Quinn was found dead in his trailer by his parents at the young age of 24 after he had placed a lava lamp on a hot stovetop. Police had absolutely no idea what he was trying to accomplish with the lava lamp on the stove, but the heat ended up causing the lamp to explode and propel shards of glass outwards. Some of those shards of glass went directly into Philip's heart, killing him pretty much instantly. What's even more surprising is that police claimed that they found no evidence of drugs or alcohol at the residence. The guys simply thought it was a good idea to stick the lava lamp on a hot stove, even without being intoxicated. Maybe he just wanted to see what would happen, and if so, well, I guess he got his wish, but what a way to go. Number 7. Air compressor murder. Compressed air is serious business, and it can also be used to murder. This next story involves 2 men from Japan and an extremely dumb decision that resulted in one man's death and one man being arrested and taken to jail. It all happened when a Japanese worker decided to let his co-worker force compressed air up his rectum. That's right, these 2 guys decided it would be a great idea to inject a blast of compressed air into this particular spot on the body. This happened at the Ibaraki Tsukuba City manufacturing plant while the 2 men were messing around on their break. According to Fox News, a man named Yoshida blasted air up a guy named Ishimaru's butt and he died. Just minutes after the air went up his butt, he began to feel ill. He had to be taken to the hospital and he later perished from internal injuries. His coworker admitted what happened to the authorities and then he was arrested for it. But what makes this story so remarkable is that in a statement, the police said it was not the first accident of its kind. Apparently, this kind of thing happens more frequently than you'd think. And what makes it even more incredible is that the air compressor was not even pushed against the man's skin. The air compressor was only pushed against his clothing, but the release of air still went up his butt and caused immense damage to his lungs. And that's what caused the man to die. Number 6. Death by reclining chair. Most people go to a movie theater to relax, eat some popcorn, and be entertained. But one unfortunate man in the United Kingdom went to the movie theater to meet his untimely doom. It was a tragic accident that happened in 2018 at the View Cinema Complex in Birmingham. The way this guy died was not only dumb, it was also super embarrassing. He allegedly dropped his phone between two seats and then bent down to pick it up. This seems pretty normal and everything probably would have been fine, except that the guy got his head stuck inside the electronic footrest. The man was with his partner at the time, and they screamed for help, and movie theater staff rushed to try and get his head free from the footrest. Unfortunately, the man died anyway. But wait for it, he didn't actually die from being suffocated by the footrest. By the time the movie theater staff had broken the chair open to free the guy, he had already had a heart attack. He was then rushed to the nearest hospital. Paramedics were successful in restarting his heart, but then several days later, the man died from injuries he had sustained while being stuck in the chair. This is definitely one of the worst ways anyone has ever died. He was only trying to pick up his phone when the reclining chair murdered him. Number 5. Over the edge. The last guy dropped his phone and died trying to find it, and this next story is about a man who dropped his spectacles and then fell to his death trying to find them. This happened at Victoria Falls in Zambia. This is one of the biggest and most spectacular waterfalls in the entire world. As you can imagine, it's not the kind of place you want to be tumbling over the edge. But that's exactly what happened when what was supposed to be a fun and adventurous holiday turned into a tragic nightmare. He had apparently been on vacation with his family when he tumbled into the gorge of Victoria Falls. It all happened when the man dropped his glasses and bent over to try and find them. While he was padding across the ground for his glasses, he ran out of ground, and he just kind of simply fell off the edge. He went about 120 feet down a rock face before hitting the ground and dying instantly. At this same spot, there have been other accidents in the past. Victoria Falls is a relatively dangerous place to go, and over the years, several bodies have been retrieved after similarly horrifying incidents. But what makes this guy's death so dumb is that he'd literally been looking for his glasses and couldn't even see that he was about to tumble off the cliff. That's a major fail. Number 4. The case of Governor Morris. Believe it or not, one of the founding fathers had the most humiliating and dumb deaths out of anyone in history. I'm talking about Governor Morris, who died after sticking a whalebone in his urethra to try and cure an infection, but it obviously didn't work. If you want some background on Morris, he was born in 1752 in New York. He later moved to Philadelphia and worked in law, and he even represented Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention where he signed the Confederation and the Constitution. He was considered a forward thinker for the times, and he was instrumental in many national affairs up until the early 1800s. Then in 1816, Morris died at the age of 63. He'd been suffering from what he thought was a urinary tract infection, but what modern historians believe was probably prostate cancer. Rather than risking death by infection, Morris thought it would be a good idea to insert a piece of whalebone into his urethra to try and clear the internal blockage. But rather than helping the infection he already had, he only got a worse infection. He also seriously injured himself in the process. Within just a few weeks, Morris passed away at his family home in New York. Suffice it to say, if you think you have a urinary tract infection, you probably shouldn't jam any whalebones into any of your holes. Number 3. Distracted driving. This next one is quite embarrassing. There's a reason why most places have made it illegal to use your phone while you're driving. It's called distracted driving and it's very dangerous. But one guy in Michigan took the dangers of distracted driving to a shocking new level. According to the Detroit News, this driver had no pants on. He was watching adult videos on his phone, and he was driving down the street without wearing a seatbelt. One of the representatives from the Michigan State Police claimed that it was one of the strangest incidents he'd ever dealt with during his career as a law enforcement officer. The pantsless driver lost control of his vehicle while watching his adult videos, and the car rolled over, and he was partially ejected through his sunroof. As you can probably piece together in your mind, it was an extremely gruesome scene that the police arrived at. The guy was horribly mangled and dead when they arrived, and I wouldn't be surprised if the police found his phone close by with the adult video still playing. The lesson here is that the next time you're driving down the highway and get in the mood, just try and leave your pants on and your phone in the glove compartment. Number 2. Hand grenade mishap. We started this video today with a man being killed by a cobra while taking a selfie. Now it's time to talk about the man in Russia who died after posing for a photo with a live hand grenade. According to the police, Alexander Chekik died instantly when the grenade went off in his hand. It doesn't get any dumber than this. The Russian man pulled the pin from the hand grenade and proceeded to post photographs of him holding the grenade. This happened in the city of Labinsk, a pretty rural place in the south of Russia. Alexander had been texting his friend back and forth about the situation he was in with the hand grenade. Unfortunately, after asking, "How are you?" Alexander's friend never got a text back. That's because Alexander couldn't get the pin back in the grenade, and it exploded with him holding it, essentially ripping his body in half. If anything, at least Alexander died instantly. What's really horrible to think about are those last few seconds when he realized the grenade was gonna go off and he just couldn't do anything about it. I mean, that must have been horrible, but at the same time, we should all just know better than to play with a live grenade, right? I mean, come on. Number 1. Gasoline cocktail. Gasoline is poison. Drinking gasoline is obviously a horrible idea, and drinking enough gasoline can definitely kill you. But when you add fire to the situation, you have certain doom. This next story comes from North Carolina, when a man named Gary accidentally guzzled a jar of gasoline. He'd been at his friend's apartment when he accidentally mistook a jar of gas for a jar of something tasty. It's unclear exactly what kind of tasty beverage he could have possibly thought was being stored inside of the glass jar, but it's pretty clear that you shouldn't be drinking out of random glass jars in people's houses. But don't worry, this story gets even dumber as we go on. So Gary accidentally drank some of the gasoline. He took a huge gulp, realized what it was, and then spit the rest out, and unknowingly got gas all over his clothes. If he'd only taken a gulp of gasoline, Gary would probably have lived to have seen at least one more day, but he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. After drinking gasoline, Gary decided to step outside and have a cigarette. When he lit his cigarette, Gary burst into flames. He was taken immediately to the hospital with horrifying burns, but Gary died later that morning. In case you live under a rock and didn't know that gasoline is flammable, after for whatever reason you drink gas, there are still fumes inside your body that can be easily ignited. Add smoke and fire to the mix, and you kinda turn into a human hand grenade. According to the Havelock police, alcohol was definitely involved in the incident, and this shouldn't be too surprising to anyone. The most ridiculous deaths and dumbest decisions are typically made while under the influence of alcohol or some other substance. So let this be a lesson. Don't drink gas and then light up a smoke. Or, don't drink gas. Do you have any close calls with making dumb decisions? Let me know your stories in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and come back soon for another awesome video.